Also, so slideshows.
What we go wrong is, I don't think we should do that. I was just saying.
All right, we're about to kick this off, so if you guys want to grab a seat, we'll get going here in just a minute. Problem, always.
We're trying.
Okay, I'm ready. Sorry, I'm back
No,
there.
it's all
Really
good.
quiet.
I've got a couple more people jumping on, so please, everyone, get comfortable, grab a seat. Welcome, come on in. Perfect. Hey, come on in. Just about to start, so please grab a seat, be comfortable. What time is it? Are we at 5:30 on the dot? Is Jessica on the call yet? Probably not, you can't see. Okay, that's fine. She's got the Zoom meeting info, so. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our open house event for 2022. This is a somewhat new format for us that we're experimenting with, but we've been doing a lot of work over the last year, a lot of exciting work, and I think we're really excited to share with you what we've done and some of the initial findings of kind of what we're working on. And so we're letting you in early into the process as we're midway through some of these things, but we're going to run through several presentations over the next 40 minutes or so. We'll have some Q&A at the end, but if you think of anything, as always, reach out, connect with us. We're really excited to see you guys here. I think we all work with you at different points. But again, this is our chance to kind of showcase what we're doing over the past 12 months or so. So the format that we're going to have today is I'm going to run through a presentation of our kind of end of year report and our plan of work, which really kind of sets out the structure of what we're going to do over the next year. Daniel Castaneda is going to be presenting an update on our talent demand survey and some of the initial findings and research for that. And finally, Amy Elliott will be coming up to give us an update on our housing research and kind of initial strategic thoughts on that. So it's going to be action-packed. Again, we'll try to run through these presentations at a really high level. Think of questions and certainly either ask them at the end or we'll have to facilitate a Q&A or get in touch another time. So Daniel, you can kick us off. So one thing that's really guiding our work right now is we're realizing that the larger economy is changing. Our approach to economic development is needing to change as well. And it's communities like Ada, where we've had first a very agrarian community turning into a manufacturing production-based economy. We see really the great economic growth and economic wealth that's going to be created in the future will likely be created through technology, through knowledge-based work, and through jobs that look very different than maybe the ones we have now. And those industries, those jobs are going to require a different way of thinking. And so I think as a result, our approach to economic development is going to have to require a different way of thinking and a different kind of culture and approach. So it's a key point I want to make at the beginning, but in the short term, something that's really been guiding our work, and we did a strategic update in 2020 with Allison Larson Tazzo. OG&E helped us with that. We had support from the city of Ada, and I think one of the things that we realized through this is through a number of focus groups, through a lot of input, through a lot of research, is our economic growth is really limited in three key ways. And so our ability to create new jobs won't occur if we don't have a thriving innovation ecosystem. It's not going to occur if we don't have sufficient talent to fill the jobs that we create. And then it's not going to occur if we don't have the housing and the community and the infrastructure to support the people living here to work in those jobs. So we've really kind of organized our staff, our organization, our work around addressing these three key areas. So this was sort of the strategy structure of all this. So we had a strategic initiative. And coming out of that, everything we just mentioned are areas or pillars of work to really address these areas. So entrepreneurship and rural innovation is going to be handled by our Build to Scale staff. So in 2021, we were the recipient of the EDA Build to Scale grant, big deal, national grant. It's going to create 4 new staff positions completely focused on supporting scalable tech startups in our region. And so a lot of our work around rural innovation is going to be focused on working with the staff. As I mentioned, huge need for talent and huge need to work with our existing industries that are expanding and creating new jobs. Daniel's going to talk specifically about that, but a lot of that work is under Daniel's kind of day-to-day. And then last year, we were really excited to create a new position in housing and community development. So that's something Amy works on day-to-day. You'll hear more from her about that. And then, oh, go back, sorry. Then we included one more area where we've identified as capacity development, but we've recognized that none of this work can occur if we don't have the capacity as a community, the capacity as an organization. And it's something we need to really think about in terms of how do we make programs and work and people be sustainable as we move forward. So early on, we didn't really know exactly what to call this. I think early in the strategy, we were like, this is kind of like public financing. But as we've grown into the strategy and worked through it, we've realized it's so much more than that. So we'll touch on that. But this is just a quick organization structure, the people I described. So you can see Daniel and Amy there. One new hire we're excited about is Sunny Dawn Baker, who's here in the audience. So Sunny's our first Build to Scale hire, and she is our digital content manager for the ecosystem. And she's really telling the story of entrepreneurship in our region and inspiring people to participate and be involved. And see this because we're realizing that no one's really telling the story here. And it's really important that we do. So just wanted to make a few key points about the previous year. So as I mentioned, we received an EDA Build to Scale grant award. We were successful in leading a community stakeholder group to receive a Center of Workforce Excellence. It's a state designation that hopefully will unlock some additional opportunities for funding and grants. But one key thing that it did is it helped us create a community strategy around workforce development, which has led to our talent demand survey. So that was really great. As I mentioned, along with this talent demand survey, we've been able to do year-end visits with almost all of our major manufacturers. And as we're getting around to the rest of our major export service companies, that's giving us a really good up-to-date look at the needs for local companies and how we might be able to align partnerships or programs to help them. Finally, we convened all of our action teams for the strategy. So our strategy called for action teams to occur in these 3 pillar areas. We've been busy working with these action teams to carry out work in their structure. Also, we've been able to support 2 companies through a Startup Data Bootcamp. We presented 4 finalists to pitch at the Big Pitch programs. The Big Pitch 8 is our annual pitch competition we started. Our Business Improvement Grant is our grant focused on Main Street and downtown Ada. $5,000 match grants. We've committed $82,000 in grants for the fiscal year, which are allocated towards 22 projects. So I think this is really exciting. We're seeing this program grow, and I think it's so far to date, we've seen about $500,000 or so total investment on Main Street, specifically through the grant program. That's just the $500,000 we have receipts for. That's not counting other people that have spent more than that or been inspired by the grant. And finally, we've led 3 housing and neighborhood focus groups. So that's something we'll continue engaging on in the future. And something Amy's going to talk a little bit more about today. So I want to talk a little bit about, we talk about programs, but we also talk about outcome metrics. And this is something I'll touch on later on, but as an economic development organization, as a nonprofit, we don't create the jobs that we're trying to seek in the community. We create a few, but it's really the entrepreneurs and the local businesses that are expanding to create the job. So we try to look at, hopefully the outcome of our programs is we want to see this positive economic growth. And so we track these big outcome metrics. And so overall, they look really positive, but there's some things that we're trying to track that are, we're trying to be aware of in the future. So, our average monthly employment is measured through the local area employment statistics from May to April of this year has increased by about 1.6%. Since the pandemic, I think the bigger headline is, and Daniel's going to talk a lot more about this, but we've essentially recovered, any jobs that, were lost in that dip. And so we're seeing maybe modest, if not steady growth, but that's translated to about an average of about another couple hundred jobs in the community over the course of the year. This ties into things like housing and workforce development. And Daniel, again, I don't want to steal your thunder, but there are more jobs being created than we're creating in terms of housing units, and there are more jobs being created than we have in terms of population growth year over year. So that's something to keep in mind is we're growing faster than our community is able to support. The unemployment rate has dropped by about 40% from about 4.9% to 2.9%. Normally that's good, but as we're seeing, this is a sign of a very tight labor market, an increasingly tight labor market. When the unemployment rate drops low, it's hard to find available people to work. It's hard to find them in a way that's affordable for local companies. Our average wage has continued to climb year over year. This 4 to 5% is typical for our wage growth. So this is a collection of all the employers in Castaneda County when they submit their quarterly tax filings or the Employment Securities Commission. This is essentially that average of all the wages, both public and private in our community. So we see this as a really good sign, but we're also cautious of this, where we see this is our sign that we have a very tight labor market. Costs are continuing to climb significantly. A few years ago, this was below 40,000. Now we're almost up to 50,000. That's the average annual wage for the county. So again, we think this is key. We think this is probably indicative of a very tight labor market, and wages are going up to meet that huge increase in demand for talent. But we're also seeing that with this increase in jobs and increase in wages, increase in sales tax collection. So that's key for us in terms of this all works because when a job is created in an export company and an employee spends money in the community, ultimately we're hoping that this helps our community's resilience and ability to do things like create infrastructure, provide public safety through these sales tax collections. So we think that if we're doing our job well, and these jobs are being created and people are getting paid well when they're spending money in the community, we should see this in their sales tax receipts. And that's been the case. One change, and this is, I think, has been similar to other communities our size or other rural communities, is this has increased significantly, I think, because people are spending more money locally. And we don't know if this is a trend, but we're encouraged by it, and we think this is lining up with the data we have. So I want to talk real quickly about some of the current work and initiatives that we're doing. But as I mentioned, we're working on a long-term strategy that we last updated in 2020. We do an annual plan of work that organizes how we're going to carry out that strategy. We'd like to update that through a year. We try to make this very dynamic. And then finally, we have action teams that are producing their own strategies. All these are working in parallel, and we're moving all these forward in the year. So I'll talk really quickly about the Rural Innovations program. So build a scale programming. We're currently in the process of hiring staff. Our goal is to launch a new accelerator program, hopefully by next year. But we're also going to be doing new monthly events. We're going to be doing new media content that Sunny will be responsible for on a very frequent basis. We're going to be organizing quarterly leadership roundtables in the region. And hopefully when we have everyone hired, we'll be doing investor outreach and hopefully a commercialization workshop. So that's included in that. We're also really focused on opening a new innovation center, hopefully at the North Annex building a block away from here. That'll house our build and scale programs as well as our other entrepreneurship events and activities. We're also focused on helping the city of Ada. We helped them write a USDA RISE grant that will create $750 million of new construction funds to renovate the old fire station to transform that into an innovation center as well. We're also going to be carrying out a feasibility study for a new incubator. We're going to kick that off this summer. And then finally, we're going to continue our existing entrepreneurship support. I'm out of time, so we're going to roll on that. Let's go to the next slide. BRE, as I mentioned, we're going to continue carrying out a sort of workforce excellence strategy to connect private sector employers with educators, with students, help build education pathways, career awareness. Our existing BRE program, we're working on a grant to develop a new site, which is really exciting. And then finally, we are doing some target industry research and marketing, especially in the areas of aviation, aerospace, plastics, and water tech. And this group also has an action team that Dana is leading. So next slide. And so for community development, as I mentioned, the business improvement grants going to continue. This program is going to grow from 75,000 funding to 100,000 in pass-through grant funding. Currently working on a community housing strategy, and also that neighborhood nonprofit capacity building that I touched on earlier. And then that has a community development action team as well. Amy's going to talk a lot about that. I'm speaking really fast because we got a lot of information around that. So I mentioned capacity development, but we're looking at a grant strategy and some ways to leverage. We're currently able to utilize both private funds as well as Prop 2 funds at the local level, but we're trying to find ways to bring in new sources of funding to carry out some of these programs over a multi-year period. So that's part of that. And then we're also looking at ways to make our board, and not just our board, but some of the existing groups and organizations that we work with stronger. So making sure that, especially volunteer groups have access to leadership, have access to training. If we can advocate for economic development and make sure we have good structures that help govern that and oversee that, I think that's a real role for that. We want to continue telling our stories as an organization and advocating for the role of economic development. So we're going to keep doing marketing and outreach by continuing to feature articles. We're going to continue our social media posting. We're in the process of launching our new website, which is really exciting. So that's all the work that's going to continue with that over the next year. And finally, it's important to us that we have well-trained and staff that can really do the job that we need to do well at a professional level. So we're ensuring that our staff development is a key component of capacities of organization to serve and carry out the programs. And so I want to just run through 3 takeaways, and I'm going to be done because I'm definitely out of time. But one interesting thing about this is something that we included in the final plan of work document, which we can send to anyone after this, is all of our programs and everything that we do has a partner, at least one partner attached to it. So, there's nothing that we do alone in this community, which shouldn't be a surprise, but I think it's really notable that every single one of our programs is partnership driven. And I think every single one of our programs that we're doing, we're not able to do alone. I want to go over this because I think this is a key thing, but I think this is guiding our work. This is where I think this helps align our work. But if we're thinking about the idea that wealth is created through companies exporting and bringing dollars in, and new jobs are created by entrepreneurs, whether it's an entrepreneur that founded a company 100 years ago or founded a company a year ago, entrepreneurs are the source of new jobs. And so really our goal is to support entrepreneurs to create wealth in exporting industries. That is our job, that's our mission, and that's something that I think is evident in our plan of work that we're going to carry through. And finally, this is a really dynamic process, and we're going to keep changing things. And so our plan of work is a plan of work 1.0. We're going to continue making revisions, but I think also knowing that our ability to help this community, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we have to change our approach to economic development. Companies are realizing in the private sector that they need to be more agile, more dynamic. Our strategies and our approach needs to be agile and dynamic. We can't go through a really old school 5-year plan, let it sit on a shelf, and then start this whole process over again when we shuffle in new staff or something like that. We need structures and I think a community that's sustainable. And I think we need to start thinking about how that factors into how we do our work. One thing that can really help us is we realize that we need a lot of flexibility in how we carry out these programs. We need to track information and track metrics, but I think we need to be ready to change things and move things around as needed. So slide, but we really appreciate your support. We really appreciate you guys coming out tonight, or if you're tuning in at some point online, and we hope to continue working with you. So with that, I'm going to bring Daniel up, and we're going to switch presentations around. He's going to talk about the Talmud and Sermon.
Hello, everyone. So for those of you that don't know me, I am Castaneda, and I am the Economic Development Specialist here at the Eldridge Foundation. Over the past several months, the Eldridge Foundation, along with Monotone Technology Center, have been conducting a talent demand survey to learn more about business recruitment practices, to assess what talent demand is in the area, and to find out what kind of skills employers are looking for from talent. With manufacturing, IT, STEM, and healthcare being the main industries in the region, we began our survey with manufacturers and several export companies. While we're not completely done with the survey, we've already met with about 90% of the local manufacturers in Ada. As part of our business retention and expansion program, we expect to go through these surveys on a yearly basis to track how companies are changing and to see how talent is keeping up with these changes. Again, the goal with these surveys is to identify what is limiting people's ability to work, to see how skills are changing over time, and to help increase pipelines into the key industries of the area. The first key finding that we found with the survey is that talent demand is outstripping the supply of available workers in the workforce. We found that of the 30,000 plus people living within the county, only 18,866 people are in the labor force, and only about 476 people are unemployed in the county. While this is a low unemployment rate, it's not all that appealing when we found out that there's over 350 jobs available within the companies that we surveyed, and not accounting for the jobs available within the other industries. What these figures show us is that all employers are fighting for the same talent, and some companies are left hiring individuals that may not necessarily have all the skills necessary to fulfill their jobs. We expect this demand to only increase, especially in roles dealing with frontline management, IT, machine operators, industrial maintenance, and any job within the healthcare realm. We also found that if this problem persists, manufacturers should expect higher labor costs, lower production, automation, and long-term depression on demand. With this survey, we found that employers are looking for individuals that have the ability to communicate effectively, have basic math skills, and have some sort of digital skills. With jobs requiring people to send emails and use different platforms to communicate, that digital competency is needed for almost every job. What most employers have told us is that the younger talent is having the most difficulty when it comes to performing a lot of these duties, which leads to upper management having to go back and retrain a lot of these individuals and leading to less efficiency at these companies. While we recognize that schools have standardized testing to see how students are performing in these areas, we believe that there needs to be a greater emphasis on communication-based skills programming, math and computer training, especially with students that are not necessarily on that four-year college track. Which leads us into our next finding. Local employers have identified that there is not a clear link between students that have graduated and jobs. Many times students go through programs, whether it be at the high school level or at the university, but they don't really know what different career pathways are available to them once they've graduated. This could be because there is some gaps in the career readiness trainings between the high schools and the different university departments. With the lack of mentorships, especially within the manufacturing realm, and the low number of career discovery opportunities in the county, there is low awareness among younger talent on the job availability within the key industries of the area. Out of all the manufacturers that we surveyed, only 32% of them had an established internship program at their companies. Not only is this a low figure, but a lot of these programs are aimed at individuals that are over the age of 18. Many of the survey participants said that they would be willing to begin their outreach at the junior high level because they have found that it is harder to pull people back into jobs once they have graduated over some time. Finally, we cannot talk about workforce issues without recognizing that social issues. We cannot talk about workforce without recognizing that social issues are limiting talent availability. Access to reliable public transportation, affordable housing, affordable childcare, access to broadband, and access to mental health services are needed to help people to get to work. The need for these resources is especially found in places like Ada where access is limited and disproportionate. Almost every participant noted that the lack of housing in Ada limits a company's ability to attract outside talent, and broadband deficiencies limit awareness of career opportunities. With that, we found that people are willing to commute further away for a job, but it is difficult to retain these employees if they do not have access to these social safety nets. Now, while we don't have all the solutions for all of these problems, we did compile a list of recommendations to help address a lot of these workforce issues. One of which is to capture students that do not have jobs upon graduation. We believe that capturing these individuals along with those students that are not on the four-year college track, they could be targeted to enter the key industries of the area. Being intentional with these students and providing a guide that outlines earning potential based on trainings and education could help in spreading that awareness and developing a pipeline into many of these companies that we interview. Another thing that we recommend and something that a lot of people suggested that we surveyed is having an area recruiter that targets local talent specifically for local manufacturers. A lot of the people that we spoke to said that they don't have the HR personnel to go through the HR screenings. So having a recruiter would help with that, and it would also help in tying students to the local different workforce programs that are available to them. An interesting thing that somebody suggested who we surveyed was having more seasonal events or summer camps or any activity that gives students more of a hands-on experience with projects. One of the things that me and Jim talked about through this process, and even with the people that we surveyed, is just being more creative in the way that we introduce programs to students, because I think a lot of the way, whenever we talk about workforce, I don't know, we kind of like put them in the box, and then students can't envision what is, what they're able to do for themselves and with their careers. So a lot of you are probably asking, so what now? Well, for those of you that don't know, I know Jim kind of just mentioned it. We got our Center of Workforce Excellence designation, like I think last month. Through that, we developed our Depth Workforce and Talent Action Team, which we came up with a strategy to increase the number of people entering the workforce into the key areas of the region, which is all these. But we also think that we could benefit from creating a dedicated marketing plan for all 4 target career pathways, piloting new training programs for emerging industry career needs, creating funding opportunities to build capacity for the programs, and expanding the career discovery day that we already have. We really want to be intentional with the way we target individuals to enter these industries, because we essentially want to work on making it a place where people want to work, play, and stay. We think that through their partnerships with ECU, PTC, the City of Ada, different employers, and I know the Southern Workforce Board will be really addressing the issues that we're facing. But yeah, I know that we're still working on the report, but if you guys are interested, we do have a little QR code available here and on the poster, and then it'll link you to our report once it's done. And then I'll hand it off to Amy.
Thank you. I'm excited that I get to talk about housing. This is going to be fun. Okay, so this is an overview of where we're going with a final report. We're going to talk context, we're going to talk why it matters, and show some possible solutions that we're batting around. The fact is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and this problem is not new. So next slide. So who are we? We're going to put this into context. It's an overview of our current housing situation. Next slide. Like I said, Ada's housing shortage is not new. I read the 1971 Comprehensive plan. It mentions that Ada is in desperate need of workforce housing and creating new solutions to get housing in our community. It's over 50 years ago. Our housing shortage is not just at workforce housing, it is at all price points. We're looking at solutions at the affordable housing level. We're looking at midpoint pricing, and we're also looking at executive housing. We do not have enough housing for the people who want to live here, for the jobs that we're creating. We don't have places for people to live. There are financing challenges in the houses that we do have. If we're looking at the traditional neighborhoods, we have limitations to, there's subsidized mortgages through USDA. Those are usually limited to houses that are under 2,000 square feet. They're looking at a limited or a ceiling for income, but you cannot have things like income producing properties. So in the traditional neighborhoods where you have a lot of garage apartments, those houses are automatically taken off of out of consideration. If those houses are on a lot that doesn't conform with current zoning standards, it's not an option for lending. In those traditional neighborhoods, what we found is that the lots don't comply with current zoning. That new zoning was placed over the top of it. Those are out of an option. We have escalating costs. Whether we're looking at that housing shortage that has now driven up the cost of housing, 15 to 20% over the past year, or the supply chain issues that are driving up the costs of lumber, that are limiting the availability of materials. All of those things are escalating costs. And I mentioned our zoning codes are not compliant to our traditional neighborhoods. And if you want to build, a lot of times you're having to go through a much longer process. You go through the City of Ada's Board of Adjustments, that's slowing things down and further escalating those costs. Frankly, people don't want to go through the process. So it's a disincentive to infill. So next slide. I'm going to stop and do just a high level overview of some definitions. I mean, we're talking single family housing, which is that traditional house that's on a lot, or you've got an acre out of the county, just that one single family house. In Ada, it's usually zoned R1. Obviously, if you're in the county, you don't have to deal with zoning. Multifamily housing would be apartment complexes. It's higher density housing. You have more than one family living in one structure. Mixed use housing is what you see downtown. You've got, when you think of a traditional city, especially in New York City, you've got living on second, third, fourth floors. You have retail, office space on the bottom floor. That's what we have in this core downtown area. There is a lot of housing that's down here. There's also the potential for development, and we need to figure out how to vary those cost constraints to getting more housing. We are in a high rental market. That's to be expected because it's a college town. We average about 55% rental versus 45% home ownership. There are neighborhoods in Ada that are, we're looking at more like 90%. So depending on where you are in town, you're going to have a higher rate of rental. Some of what happens with a higher rate of rental homes is you have more deferred maintenance. If you as the landlord have no way of getting more money out for rent, you've already hit that maximum point. It is hard to justify putting additional funds into keeping those homes maintained. You don't have usually the same landscaping. There's a lot that happens when you end up having a neighborhood that transitions into that 75 to 90% rental. Traditional neighborhoods is something that is going to keep coming up in this report. We're looking at those neighborhoods that were developed pre-1940. The reason that we call those a traditional neighborhood is the lots are smaller. We don't have, we have older housing stock. We are usually looking at affordable housing. It's where we're looking at redeveloping and areas for workforce housing and affordable housing, and that entry level housing price point. We'll talk a lot about infill versus greenfield development. Infill is when you're looking at a neighborhood and you have an empty lot. So we recently saw a lot on West 10th. There was a house that was torn down. They're coming back in and trying to redevelop that lot. You're looking at neighborhoods you have access to existing city services. Greenfield is when you go in and you're developing a new subdivision. And that's happened. The Oaks would be a greenfield development. There are a number of neighborhoods around town that are greenfield. So you're developing a new subdivision. And then we're going to talk a lot about code enforcement versus code rewrite. You're looking at blight abatement. We have codes on the books that address things like mowing your lawn, that you need to have windows. I mean, there's things that we can address if we are able to go in and enforce the existing code. That is tough to do, especially we are in the South and people have this idea that my property is my own, I can do what I want. So if you start walking in and enforcing these things like you have to mow your lawn, you can't park on the lawn. I mean, there's things that are just gonna have people off. It's tough to do, and the fact is we are dealing in a political environment that our cities want to get along. A code rewrite is going in and addressing things like that R1 limitation to where you have setbacks. You can't build a house if you don't have enough room between houses. We're looking at things like higher density use. How do we get more houses in the same block? How do we create a code that would allow people to live and build homes the way that they're currently wanting to function and have neighborhoods function? Those are definitions. So next slide. We also have an issue with finding housing. We have a lot of neighborhoods that are getting where there are vacant housing and dilapidated housing, which seems to spread. I mean, once you start getting into a neighborhood that has significant disinvestment, it just keeps going. It keeps getting pockets of more and more disinvestment. Then you end up having a higher rate of crime. It spreads. You have a perception that living in town is more expensive and more difficult than living in the county. We have to address these perception issues as well, and why you would want to do infill development versus going out and doing greenfield. On days on market, so over the last 6 months, a couple of days ago, I had a few of the real estate agents pull their records. Houses between $200,000 and $300,000 were on the market on average for 3 days before they went to pending. Of those, there were a lot that went within a day. There were some that went within minutes. We know that at the end of May, there were 14 houses in the entire county that were still available to purchase. All of the others were pending. So we had 14 across all price points across the entire county. We do not have the available housing stock for people to buy. It's forcing things like commuting patterns are we have a significant amount of our workforce that's commuting, but from larger than or longer distances than 25 miles away. Those people, especially as fuel costs are rising, are much more vulnerable to finding a job somewhere else. We are not the only community that's dealing with this workforce shortage. People are competing for talent. It is a regional issue on talent. But basically, we're down to supply is the issue. When I talk about that this is not a new problem, you have demand and you have supply. So if we know that there is a demand for housing, which we do, there's evidence with the 3-day average on market, then we have to figure out how to increase supply. Supply is our issue. All right, so I'm gonna start talking faster. I get really stuck in context. Yes, I have to talk really fast because I got a lot. Our primary goals.
Amy, please take your time.
No, I want to go fast.
Okay.
Ready. Our primary goals are to increase the availability of housing across all price points. We are also going to have to address zoning and the infrastructure issues that are barriers to getting housing in place. We have to reduce funding gaps. As prices have escalated, We have an average appraised value of homes coming in at around $140 a square foot. And so we're looking at an average, obviously, there's a range, but at $140 a square foot, 1,000 square foot house is gonna appraise at around $140,000. We're starting out pricing people out of the market. We're also starting out pricing developers out of taking advantage of this market because they can't build. The average price for construction at the end of May was at $145 a square foot. We can't build. They don't have the ability to make a profit. We have got to figure out how to reduce those funding gaps. And we have to involve stakeholders across the board to find sustainable solutions. There is not going to be a magic horse that runs in and says, here's our housing solution. We have to work across lots of different issues and lots of different sectors. Okay. Next slide. Why it matters. Keep going a little faster. Frankly, not having the housing we need limits our options for economic growth. We cannot fill jobs if we don't have people that have a place to live. We cannot keep people in jobs if we don't have that adequate housing. If they don't feel like they are connected to the place they live, they're not going to build those relationships and they're going to be looking for their next spot. We don't allow without those options for housing. So we've got 1,000 square feet starting at $140,000. I think I'm just going to start ignoring your timing. Over here. If you have that entry-level house starting at $140,000, you don't have the ability for these young professionals to get ingrained in the community. So if they're not having a house that makes them feel like they belong, they're not developing the relationships. If they're not developing the relationships, then they don't stay. So if we don't have a way to get people to get involved, develop friendships, get involved in clubs, they are going to leave. And frankly, people spend their money where they live. With these community patterns, even though we have people coming in, they're taking their dollars and they're spending them where they live, which means that we don't get to capture those sales tax dollars. Okay, next slide. Talked about the vacant housing and how this is a limitation to infill, that perception, those vacant houses, not having that ability to create neighborhoods where you have people outside walking and living and neighborhoods functioning the way that we think neighborhoods should function, keeps people from developing relationships. Okay, next. And with that continued disinvestment, we have options in these traditional neighborhoods for homeowners to purchase. We have available housing and available lots that developers could purchase, that if we do not have people who want to live in those traditional neighborhoods, they're wasting their time. There are other places that they can build. Developers are looking at, they're not going to start building at a house that's going to appraise for less than $300,000. That's not happening in the traditional neighborhoods. So that perception, that outdated density requirements, all of these things are leading to a situation that we don't have people that are willing to put the dollars into these traditional neighborhoods, which is then just furthering that deferred maintenance. Okay. So now what? Like I said, there's no single solution. We have the at-risk housing and deteriorating neighborhoods. Some things that we can do is support code enforcement when they go in and say, you've got a house that is at that point of being condemned. We need to do something. We as a community need to support that. We all know that if you're in a situation, if you're in a city council meeting, those no's are loud. We need to be those yeses. That community needs to stand up. There are renovation grants, and there's evidence that these zero interest rate loans work for homeowners. So there's a community that is looking at the city sponsors up to a $10,000 renovation loan at 0% interest that amortizes those payments over 5 years, which ends up being right at $167, $68 a month, starting to get to an affordable level. The big grant that we've seen as successful in the community can be used as a cost share or facade improvements, or we can write whatever you need to do for renovation. There's weatherization programs. There's a lot of things out there that we can tackle and look at for renovation grants. We can look at down payment assistance. There are some cities that have taken an equity position on down payment assistance. If you live in that house for 5 years, it then is forgiven. But there are grants out there, there are federal programs that will provide assistance for down payments. And we can find ways to utilize those programs. There are also things like a CHODO, which is a community housing development organization. That organization is then tasked, it's an independent organization with an independent board that is tasked with creating affordable housing solutions in a community. Okay, next slide. Developer, we have options like land banks, infrastructure partnerships. So if a city has identified housing as a priority, we can look at going in and do a cost share for infrastructure improvements on roads and construction, water lines, whatever we need to do. We have the ability, and cities have shown that this is very successful. Lien abatements. So once a house has been declared, it's been condemned, there are costs that the city has that are associated with this house. There are communities that abate those liens. You have fee waivers. We can look at housing tax credits, whether it's historic tax credits, low-income housing tax credits. There's a lot of things that we can look at in our toolbox. We also have options with the private sector. We've talked to groups that want to come in and do a type of angel investment. Like they take an equity position in a home, and for people that don't have the credit that they need to be able to qualify for a mortgage, and then look at ways to buy out to realize their return on investment. Those exist. There's a lot that goes into it, but it's a possibility. I've talked to local lenders. Most of our local lenders package their mortgages to sell. Some of them retain the servicing rights, some of them don't, but very few of them are holding that mortgage on their books. In order to do that, they've got to package their mortgages to meet these national standards. They don't get to use alternative credit determination. We don't get to go in and take riskier loans. There's got to be a way that we can partner with local lenders to take some of this risk and keep that investment in the community. We also know that we need financial education. We don't talk about how money impacts how you live and what you're able to afford and how you can buy a house, or how you need to deal with debt to be able to use that to your advantage. We need to have these tough conversations and be willing to talk money across the board to where it's not something that's taboo. And then the last slide, this is the ask. We need to invest in our community. Community matters. That is where people choose their homes. It isn't really anymore where you have a job. We've talked about broadband. We've talked about community patterns. We have to have those quality of life things, or people aren't going to want to live here. We need to find ways that people can build relationships. We've talked about the model of you show up at a church, you end up with bread baskets and phone calls and all of these things. We need to be able to do that as a community. Say, thank you for being here. Let's see where you can get keyed in. Let's see what we can do for you to feel like you belong here. And frankly, partnerships are the only way that this happens. It isn't one organization. It isn't one funding mechanisms. It is a huge list of how to get there. And I went over time. So that's all I got.
All right, thanks, Sadie. We will get some Q&A going. I'm going to stop sharing this. Someone could